بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Dear respected brothers, what an occasion this is to hear these words from these brothers. If you only understood these words, and I'm sure most of you do. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam was the best of creation, no doubt, ala al-itlaq. There was no greater creation than the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. There was no greater orphan than the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. No greater husband, no greater father, and no greater grandfather. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam was the greatest of the creation, no doubt. And the Prophet Muhammad was no ordinary man. Absolutely true, he said, I am a man like you. But for the people to understand that he was just an ordinary person, it's absolutely completely and utterly wrong. A man came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, Ya Rasulullah, he said, I fast consecutively, where when I get to the Maghrib I keep going and I make my fast until the next day. The Prophet said that you cannot do this. I am able to do this. I am nourished and fed by Allah, but you are not. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was no ordinary man. He was a man, but he was no ordinary man ﷺ. On one occasion, the Prophet, he prayed rak'at at night, two, many twos. And then he went to have a little nap before the witr. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, O Prophet of Allah, will you sleep before witr? He said, Ya Aisha, my eyes are closed but my heart is awake. My eyes are closed but my heart is awake. For this reason, the Ahnaf, they said, for that reason the wudu of the Prophet would not break when he woke, because his heart did not sleep. This was the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said, if you visit me, meaning if you go to Medina and you visit the Prophet, the shafa'ah becomes incumbent upon him for you ﷺ. So he was indeed no ordinary man. And the Prophet ﷺ is indeed a man to be loved. He is a man to be loved, and that love of the Prophet Muhammad should not be belittled. It should not be belittled at all. In fact, the Prophet taught the love to the Sahaba. One day the Prophet was holding the hand of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. And he said, you shall not truly love, you shall not truly believe until I am dearer to you than your father and your children and the whole of mankind. In a narration, Umar said, Ya Rasulullah, I love you more than anything except myself. He said, Ya Umar, you will not truly believe until you love me more than yourself. So then Umar, he went and he reflected upon being in the time before Islam. That where would he have been without Allah sending the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to him? Where would he have been, and what would the akhirah, what would the consequence have been? And then he realized that indeed what the haqq was. And then when he came to the Prophet, he said, Ya Rasulullah, I love you now more than myself. The Prophet said, now, O Umar, now your rank of belief has reached its peak. This was the Prophet ﷺ. They loved the Prophet and he taught them that love. There was once a lady, she hand wove a garment for the Prophet ﷺ, a hand woven garment. And the Prophet at that time was in need of a garment. So then the Prophet, he wouldn't refuse a gift. He accepted the gift and he took the gift. One day the Prophet presented himself in public with that gift, wearing the upper garment. One of the Sahabi, he saw the Prophet was wearing that garment. And in all openness, with no shyness, he came to the Prophet and he said, Ya Rasulullah, would you give me that garment? With all openness. And the Prophet looked at him and he said, yes, I will give it to you. But the Prophet had some business to attend to. So he sat down with the Sahaba. After he sat down with the Sahaba, he got up, he went home, he packed the garment, he wrapped it, and he gave it to the man. The rest of the Sahaba, this is a Sahih Hadith. The rest of the Sahaba, they came to that man, to that Sahabi, they told him, why did you do that? You knew the Prophet Muhammad would not refuse your request, yet you still asked him knowing that he would not refuse your request. So you knew that if you asked him, he was going to give it up. He said, do you want to know why I asked the Prophet for that? They said, why? He said, Wallahi, I asked him for that because after seeing him wear that, I wanted it. Because so when I die, I am shrouded in that garment. And when he died, they shrouded him in that garment. That particular Sahabi. This is the hubb and love they had for the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. And that love that we should have for the Prophet should not in any way, shape or form be belittled. He was no ordinary man. He was no ordinary man, and no person should say that he was an ordinary man. He was far beyond an ordinary man. The Prophet once, alayhi salatu wasalam, he was given a drink from a cup. Somebody gave him a drink and he drank. That when somebody offers you a drink and you drink from it, that you pass it to your right. You allow the people on your right to drink from that cup or that thing that which you're drinking from. So one day it happened that a young boy was on the right-hand side of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu. Who was sitting on the left? All the old men, the elderly. So the Prophet alayhi salatu, he turned to the young man on the right, the young boy, and he said, would you grant me permission? Look at the Prophet alayhi, look at who he was. Look at who he was. He even took the consideration, the feelings of a young boy into consideration. He turned to the young man, to the young boy. He was a young boy. And he said, oh young boy, would you allow me and grant me permission to offer these people on my left before you? Remember we said the adab is on your right, but if you ask permission for the people on the right and they grant permission, then you can go to your left. The young boy, he said to the Prophet, it is my haqq that I drink from your blessed mouth after you have drank it from that vessel. And I deny you that. And the Prophet ﷺ took the cup and he gave it to the young boy. And he gave it to the young boy. And he did not allow those people on the left to drink from it because he says, my haqq, it is my right to drink from your blessed mouth and for me to gain from that. This was the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. This is who he was. Afdal al-khalq, khayr al-khalq. He was the best of the creation. He was the best of the creation to walk this earth, absolutely no doubt. And the love was inscribed in the heart of the Sahaba, and they loved him with a passion. And the ahadith, for example, of Hurairah, they said that it was as though the sun, when we saw the Prophet, it was as though the sun was shining from his face. It was as though the sun was reflecting on his face and coming off his face. That's what it was when we looked at the Prophet ﷺ. And in death, when Ali radiallahu anhu, when he said he washed the Prophet ﷺ, sometimes when you wash a dead body and you squeeze something comes out of him as comes out of mankind naturally. And when Ali radiallahu anhu, he squeezed the Prophet and nothing came out of him, he said, may my father and mother be ransomed for you. You were pure in life and pure in death. This was the Prophet alayhi sallam, khayrul khalq, the best of the creation. The love of the Prophet should not be belittled. The love of the Prophet should not be watered down. The love of the Prophet should be increased in the heart. What does Allah say in the Quran? Allah says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu sallu alayhi wa sallimu taslima. This is fa'al amr. The ulama said at least once in your life, at least once, you should say Allahumma salli wa sallim ala Muhammad. Why? Because it's fa'al amr that Allah has given in the Quran. So imagine the recommendation that a person were to constantly and consistently say Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Muhammad. Imagine the rewards. Imagine. The Prophet no doubt was the best of creation. There was once a man came to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and he said to the Prophet, he was trying to poke anger into the Prophet. He said, I had given you a loan. He said, and I do not know people like you to delay in repaying the debt. The Prophet hadn't delayed his debt, but the man was trying to bring out the anger in the Prophet. So Umar jumps up and he says, Ya Adu Allah, how dare you speak to the Prophet like that? How dare you speak to him like that? So then the man left. The Prophet said to Umar, calm down. The Umar was you can imagine Umar. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, look Umar, take this thing that was owed to the man and on top give him an extra 20 sa'i. 20 sa'i is about 30 to 40 kilos of wheat. He said, why? He said, because you frightened the man. So then the Umar, he takes this thing, he takes this debt which was owed with the extra 30 kilograms of wheat, and he goes to the man. He said to the man, here is what you're owed, and here is the extra additional 30 kilograms of wheat. He said, what is the addition for? He said, because I frightened you. He said to Umar, do you want to know why I said that to your Prophet? He said, why? He said, I had seen every single sign of prophethood in him except two things. He said, what are they? He said that patience comes before anger, and I saw that. He said, and the second thing is with the Prophet, when the more harsh you are to the Prophet, the more generous you are. And the fact that you have given this 30 kilograms demonstrates that the more harsh I was, the more generous he became. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Rasulullah. And he accepted Islam. Umar took that man and they went to the Prophet ﷺ, and you can indeed imagine the farah. He indeed was the best of creation, and there was no better creation than the Prophet ﷺ. And I'll finish by saying this. Muhammad al-Ghazali, he mentions in his books about the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he sacrificed and the sacrifices that he made in his life. But you know what his concern was? His concern was fulfilling his task for this ummah. He is the only man on the day of judgment who will say, Allahumma ummati, ummati. Every other prophet will say, Allahumma nafsi, nafsi. This is not believing in the prophets, but this is showing the magnitude of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. That when he says, ummati, ummati, this is his magnitude, this is his character, his care and concern for his ummah. And at the last death, what part of the final words that he said, that is narrated by Aisha, and Muhammad al-Ghazali, he mentioned in his books, he said what? إِلَى رَفِيقِ الْأَعْلَى إِلَى رَفِيقِ الْأَعْلَى إِلَى رَفِيقِ الْأَعْلَى. To the highest companion, to the highest companion, to the highest companion. Aisha radiallahu anha, she knew what had happened. She knew that the Prophet was given a choice between two choices. And she said to the Prophet Muhammad, choose him, Ya Rasulullah. Choose him, Ya Rasulullah. Indicating, choose Allah. This was the Prophet ﷺ's task, to connect our hearts with Allah and to as well teach us that love of the Prophet is indeed part of